Well, good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Muddassar Ahmed, president of the Concordia Forum, and welcome to this Concordia Forum event, How George Floyd's Murder Shifted America, and Attorney General Keith Ellison's battle against racial injustice. Today, we're joined by Keith Ellison, the former US representative for Minnesota's 5th Congressional District and the current 30th Attorney General of Minnesota. Keith was the first Muslim to be elected to the US Congress and to serve as Attorney General. He's also the first African-American representative from Minnesota. Earlier this year, Keith successfully prosecuted Derek Chauvin, the former police officer, who was convicted of murdering George Floyd, a case that sparked a renewed battle against racial injustice. Nandy, who will also be delivering some opening remarks. Of course, throughout today's discussion, we will also welcome several respondents. And also just a reminder that today's panel will be recorded for an episode of my podcast, PR en Masse, but it will also be screened at the Bradford Literature Festival, which is now the 4th largest literature festival in the UK. Now, without further ado, I'd like to go straight to Lisa Nandy, the UK Shadow Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, for some opening remarks and her thoughts on this issue.
Well, Muddassar, can I thank you very much for hosting today's discussion, because the murder of George Floyd spoke to the lived experiences of people across the world. And here in the UK and elsewhere, I think it unleashed something really profound and important, a feeling, especially for younger people, that enough was enough. But that was something that brought together people of all races, of all backgrounds, and of all ages. And that was something that really struck me, having grown up in this country in the 1980s, in Manchester, witnessing the Mosque riots at first hand, and really seeing playing out across the TV screens during that moment, how people from very, very different backgrounds, for perhaps the first time in my lifetime, were coming together to stand up against racism. Now, these are universal values, and this is a global challenge. Racism is a poison, and unchecked, it spreads like a cancer. If you accept racism anywhere, you threaten equality everywhere. And it is not an American problem. It's not a British problem. Breonna Taylor, Nicole Smallman, Bieber Henry, on both sides of the Atlantic, there are women as well as men whose lives mattered and whose deaths serve as a reminder of our inability to defeat racism, inequality, and discrimination thus far. And in recent weeks, in both the UK and the United States, we've seen a rise in anti-Semitism and Islamophobic attacks as violence erupted in the Middle East. During the global pandemic, both the US and the UK have seen rising xenophobia and anti-refugee and migrant sentiment. And all of this is happening in the context of a toxic political environment, with populist movements growing in force around the world. So in the UK, we've been watching what's been happening on the other side of the Atlantic very, very closely over recent years. We watched how the growth of the alt-right, or the so-called patriot movement, burst into the open 3 years ago through the Charlottesville riot, and how the steady reach of those groups into mainstream politics, the rise of the Tea Party, its infiltration of the Republican Party, and that watershed moment when Sarah Palin was selected as a running mate by John McCain. This was a steady process through which white supremacy and fascist movements were legitimised and mainstreamed in the most powerful democracy in the world. This has ripple effects around the world. And of course, the United States is not the United Kingdom, and vice versa, and there are clear differences. But we have seen here in the UK, as we've seen in other countries, plummeting trust in politicians, the media, institutions, and each other. We've seen the spread of fake news and attacks on the mainstream media. We had a Home Secretary in Sajid Javid who tweeted about sick Asian paedophiles, and a Prime Minister who has a history of racist comments about Black Britons and Muslim women. This is the mainstreaming of racist and discriminatory views. And as Keith said, in comments that were reported all over the world when the Derek Chauvin verdict came in, this is not true justice. True justice is a social transformation that says nobody is beneath the law and nobody is above it. And he said, I wouldn't call today's verdict justice, because justice implies restoration, but it is accountability, which is the first step towards justice. And what happens next is in our hands. And those words, I think they inspired me and they inspired a lot of people, just as my dad's generation spent time in Birmingham, Alabama, in order to learn techniques to help people in Handsworth, in Moss Side, in Toxteth, and in Brixton in the 1980s. Our generation is now beginning to reach across the Atlantic as well. We've been building political partnerships between Labour and the Democrats to defeat the multiple attempts to divide us through the culture wars. And our movement is building partnerships across civil society as well. Inspired by the work of Hope Not Hate and the Southern Poverty Law Centre. These are organisations who've worked together to map and track the rise of the far right and share learning to counter hate for decades. And with our friends in the trade union movement led by the TUC and the ITUC as well, they're investing resource and energy into taking on racism and discrimination in workplaces across the world. Now, just finally say this, there's much to learn, I believe, from a generation, my dad's generation, that brought us the civil rights movement and the race equality campaign and achieved legislation on both sides of the Atlantic that they'd thought when they began may not even be possible, to outlaw racial discrimination and end inequality. They dreamed big and they made a promise to my generation, our generation, that we could grow up proud of our racial heritage, but we need not be defined by it. And that was a promise that was important to me growing up as a mixed race child in Manchester in the 1980s. But if I've learned anything in recent years, it's that progress is not inevitable. The arc of history does not always bend towards progress. And if you want a fairer society, you have to go out and you have to fight for it every single day. The task of each generation is to pick up the battles and fight and win the baton and fight and win these battles again and again and again. So I warmly welcome today's discussion and the fact that we've brought Keith to us to be able to fight these fights and to rediscover how we take power back into our own hands in order to do it. Like he says, what happens next is in our hands. And I really welcome the fact that you've brought us together on different sides of the Atlantic to discuss this and across the world, because if we learn one thing from the battles that have been fought in the past, it's that we only win this together. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa, for those powerful opening remarks, and of course, indeed, for taking time out and joining us today. Now I'd like to warmly welcome Keith. Keith, thank you for being with us here today. It's a pleasure to have you with us again. And we're going to kick off the discussion. I'm going to go straight into my first question. So on April the 20th, the jury found Derek Chauvin guilty of charges of second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. However, the case isn't finished yet. Chauvin is currently in prison awaiting his sentence, which will be announced on the 25th of June. What can we expect from the sentencing and the aftermath? And are you worried that the conviction could be overturned?
I'm not worried that the conviction can be overturned. But I want to first of all just tell you all how grateful I am to be here with you, if I may. And I want to thank your opening comments, Muddassar, and I want to thank Lisa for her opening comments as well. You're right, they were powerful. What she said was awesome. And I almost feel like saying what she said, just we're done now. Lisa cleared it all up. But it was wonderful to hear you all. And just a word, if I may, if you'll indulge me a little bit about Concordia. I am a very active and proud member of the Concordia movement. It is an excellent movement and it unites us across very different parts of the world's geography. Look, we all know the differences. We all sound a little different, but the truth is we have many more things in common than we have differences. And Concordia helps us to know that, understand that, learn that. So thank you. So now let me get back to the question you asked. So I feel very confident in the verdict. And the reason why is because as prosecutors, we didn't just try to gain a conviction. We actually worked pretty hard to make sure that the trial was fair, that Derek Chauvin was treated with fairness, and that he was convicted based on law and facts and not based on the emotion that is associated with cases like this one. It's important to make sure that the jurors were impartial. We did that. Important to make sure that no prejudicial comments or inflammatory, emotional sort of appeals were made. We didn't do that. We stuck close to the facts. We feel good about this conviction. Now, what's ahead of us is on June 25th is the date set for the sentencing. There is a slight possibility that it could get moved. I don't think it will. I don't think it will, but you know, those of you who are in and around courts, you know that anything can happen, but I think that we will be seeing a sentencing on that day. What can you expect? You're going to see family members of George Floyd, and you're going to see perhaps representatives from the community come talk about how this tragic incident impacted them. You may also see Derek Chauvin make a statement. Maybe you won't. He does not have to say anything. He can remain silent. But you may see people from his family talk about the impact of this on them. But Derek Chauvin does have a right to allocute, meaning say whatever he wants to say. He is charged with a federal case. So like in the United States, and it may be worked the same way in the UK, but I don't know. The states have their own independent sovereign authority to prosecute crime. And then the federal government also has parallel authority. They're not the same. So our case was a murder and second degree and third degree murder and manslaughter. The federal government is not prosecuting them for the same crime. It's prosecuting for civil rights violations. And the argument being that through official use of unauthorized use of force, that they deprived him of his civil rights. So there's a parallel prosecution going on. He may not say anything because he doesn't want to have those comments used in his other case. But that's what's in front of us. I expect that the day will be emotional. It'll be impactful. If those of you who are traumatized by these kind of things, brace yourself because it's going to be a rough ride. Wouldn't be surprised if you see loved ones, friends, community members speaking heartbreaking terms about the loss and the pain that this crime caused them. There's a statute in the state of Minnesota that guarantees victims, which includes family members, the right to talk about what happened, and they're going to do so.
Thank you for that, Keith, and thank you for the kind words you said about the Concordia Forum. We're very honored to have you be a member with us for all this while. We're now going to take a question from Nina Smith. Nina is the president of Polysol Public Affairs and is currently based in Los Angeles, California. Nina, over to you.
Hey there, Madam President.
Hello, good morning from LA. And I'm so grateful for this opportunity to speak with you this morning. Muddassar, thank you for inviting me. I do a lot of work with a number of on the ground grassroots organizers who are currently pushing for a different form of policing in America. As of today, 371 people, Black people, have lost their lives in 2021. And that is with some pretty substantial reforms already in place to prevent Black people losing their lives. At this point, a lot of folks have expressed support for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that includes many of the reforms that were put into place in the Minneapolis Police Department that did not prevent Mr. Floyd from losing his life. And so some of these organizers are pushing for a different approach to public safety in the form of the Breathe Act, which calls for moving bloated police budgets and money in those budgets to communities of color to really address the root problems that create public safety situations and to rethink the response we have to emergency situations in our communities, given the failures of policing in America. So my question for you is, giving your support of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and the fact that those reforms have thus far failed to keep Black people safe. What will keep Black people safe in your mind in terms of legislation or approaches we can take that don't involve our broken approach to public safety and a policing system that's rooted in slavery patrols and slavery itself? Thank you.
I wouldn't say the George Floyd Justice Policing Act has failed because we haven't even passed it. We should pass it. I think it's also important to acknowledge that policing is only a part of the problem of African descendant people in the United States. Policing is really kind of the sharp edge of the knife, but there's a whole lot more metal on that knife than just the edge of it. There's the handle, there's the screws, there's a whole big old apparatus. And policing, what policing really does is use, brute force to maintain a racial hierarchy. That's what it actually does. It's not all about the police. The police have a role to play within a larger system. And, for years, if you go to a typical Black community in the United States, you're gonna see a community that for 100 years, federal housing policy was to segregate you in only certain places. The federal housing administration, would not write insurance for mortgages in Black communities, and restrictive zoning at the local level said that only white people could live here. And this took place over the course of decades and decades and decades. And when that didn't work, white mobs just would come and just burn your house or beat you up or attack you. And so when we talk about the Black ghetto or segregated communities, we're not talking about people who have self-selected that I just want to live here. No, we were relegated to certain geographic areas. There's a 1937 planning map in the city of Minneapolis where I live. And that 1937 Minneapolis city planning map has around it North Minneapolis and South Minneapolis, and it says Negro slum there. And so it's pretty clear, you're from Los Angeles, trust me, no shortage of deliberately segregated communities right there in LA. And what is a segregated community? It's not just a community where people share melanin characteristics. It's an underinvested in community. It's a community where we don't make parks, we don't fix the roads, we don't fix the lights, where we allow a certain amount of mayhem to occur, where we don't actually do public safety. We do policing, but we don't do public safety. There back in the when the Ramparts scandal was breaking in LA, they pulled together some of the messaging that the officers would do between each other in the squads. And one of the names that officers would use for people who they suspected to be members of street gangs was NHI. What is NHI? No human involved. So Black communities were allowed to be a place where if you want to kill them or they want to kill each other, we will kind of go along with that. You want to commit crime on the streets, you want to commit, you want to allow the red light district, you want to put industrial pollution, whatever, we don't care, just stay here. And that was American policy. And it wasn't some individual racist person, it was the government. So policing was just, y'all stay in there. So let me just wrap this up. In order to keep Black people safe, or all people safe, you must reinvest in community to the degree that everyone has the kind of resources that they pay taxes for and that they deserve as human beings. You have to reinvest in healthcare, reinvest in housing, reinvest in school, reinvest in all the things that have been systematically denied to African people here in the US. And We can get specific, but that's the main idea. Anyway, that's it.
Well, I'll just say in response to that, the BREATHE Act actually has a lot of those investments. And I think the prioritization of investments over just looking at police is exactly where a lot of the movement is. So appreciate your response and giving that context, because that's exactly why we're fighting for and pushing for those sorts of investments in our communities, rather than any other additional attention or training or investments in policing.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Can
you
I just
so
say,
much.
some of our friends outside the United States probably heard this term, defund the police. You probably heard that.
Yeah.
Well, what that term really means is refund the community, or just plain old fund the community, which has never happened before. Because if in Minneapolis, we spend $193 million on the police department, how much do we spend on parks? How much do we spend on schools? How much do we spend on just nutrition programs?
Well, thank you, Nina, and thank you, Keith, for answering that. Now, coming to our next question, which is from me. Very few police officers are tried for murder, let alone convicted. In fact, since 2013, over 9,100 people, or 1,000 people per year, or 3 people each day, have been killed by police officers. However, less than 2% of officers are charged with a crime, or even fewer are convicted. Following the Chauvin verdict, you said the following in a video, which Lisa was speaking about earlier. I think we should be able to show the video here now.
I would not call today's verdict justice, however, because justice implies true restoration. But it is accountability, which is the first step towards justice. And now the cause of justice is in your hands.
So my question to you, Keith, is how can we achieve this in a system which notoriously avoids accountability? And how did you manage to successfully hold Chauvin accountable? What was different?
Well, let me say, you can't go from all bad to all good in the snap of a finger. Change is going to take dogged pursuit of justice over a long period of time by a whole lot of people. It's going to require our unity, both in the United States, the United Kingdom, throughout Europe, Africa, Asia. We're going to have to do this thing together. We will be stronger if we have an international movement which says all communities are going to be treated with justice, fairness, and respect. So that's the way it is. Just remember, in the US, for example, it was 1954 before the Supreme Court said segregation in education was not constitutional anymore. But it was 1965 till the Voting Rights Act passed. I mean, these things are not over. If you're a sprinter, the movement's not for you, right? You got to be a long distance runner to be in this thing. So that's one thing. So how do we break it? Well, first of all, we were fortunate enough to have a brilliant 17-year-old on hand who whipped out her cell phone and took 8 minutes and 46 seconds worth of video. People begin to use that time period to really organize around it. The sad reality is it wasn't quite accurate. It was actually 9 minutes and 29 seconds over which the officers were on top of George Floyd's body. We had video cam from their body worn cameras and video across the street and other videos we put together. It's actually longer than 8:46, it was 9:29. And this happened, and so after Darnella Frazier took that video and it went viral and you saw it and everybody saw it, then we were able to show over that very long period of time how fundamentally inhumane the treatment George Floyd was receiving. By the way, George Floyd didn't have a weapon, and they knew that because they checked him. He never threatened anybody. He never even said, "Get off me or I'm gonna kick your butt," nothing like that. He was always acting better than the police officers who were arresting him in every way. He did everything they asked, but George Floyd is 6'4", 250 pounds, no fat. So when they tried to squeeze him into the back of a very tiny car, he had claustrophobia, he had anxiety. He said, "Wait a minute, I'll do whatever you say. Please don't make me get back there." And then he even tried to get in there. There's tape where he says, "Okay, let me count. 1, 2, 3, I'm gonna get in there." And he tried to get in there, But they wouldn't just let him get in. They kept on at every moment trying to just jam him and force him and dehumanize him. So it was the length of the tape. It was the fact that we had the tape in the first place that really put us in a position to perhaps win. I'm not saying that's the only way to win, but you asked me how we won. And then it was the people who said that the county attorney, which works with the police department every single day, might not be a trustworthy actor in this situation. Mike Freeman, to his credit, said, would you take the case? Can we partner on this? He's the county attorney, and the governor said, we need you to do this. So we had to have other leaders who are willing to assign the case to my office, because in Minnesota, the case doesn't always come straight to the Attorney General's office. Sometimes it goes to the county. First, they go to the county attorney's office. And then this is very important, Muddassar, because the first Minneapolis Police Department communication to the world did not mention force. It did not mention, it said George Floyd died in a medical emergency in police custody. That sounds like the beginning of a whitewash if ever I ever heard one. But it was the video and the length of the video. And then it was that all these things kind of assembled to get the case in our hands. Once I had the case, I promised to myself and the Lord above that I was going to do every single thing I could possibly do to put on the best case possible. I didn't say we're going to win, because I didn't know. No one knows that. But I did know that what was in our control is to put on the best case. So I started recruiting the best lawyers I could find. And some of them were in my office already. Not all of them were. I went and had to go get some other folks who would join us. And one of them who had done a lot of police prosecution, one of them who had done a lot of law and medicine work and understood very well how the breathing mechanism worked and how people die from a lack of oxygen and the mechanics of that, who could then help us find proper experts for that. And so we put together this team that worked together. My goal was to say, look, I don't know how to play the flute the best. I don't know how to play the cello the best, but I do know how to conduct the orchestra. And we had everybody working together in a very harmonious way, no egos. And you better believe egos flared up, because you're talking about really smart people who usually get their way. So in this, I had to do a lot of side conversations to say, okay, we're not going in your way this time, but you got to understand, do you want to be the star on a losing team or a teammate on a winning team? And, we got it all together, and everybody worked really well, and everyone put forth their best effort every time. And the end result was what the world knows about. But we had some great people. One guy named Neil Katyal is the former Solicitor General for the United States. He worked for Barack Obama, and what the Solicitor General does in the U.S. system of justice is represents the government in all appeals before the Supreme Court, and often in other appellate courts. So Neil was outstanding. Jerry Blackwell, gifted trial lawyer. Steve Slisher, gifted trial lawyer. And and then we had an all-star team. And even the folks who you never knew, but I know very well, working behind the scenes, they never said, I don't want to do it unless I get some of the limelight. No, they were working tirelessly, witness prep, everything, running around looking for witnesses. And then I personally had to go talk to witnesses and talk them into coming. Because people are like, some folks like me and Muddassar, we don't mind being on the tube all over the world. We don't necessarily look for it, but we don't shy from it. It's part of the job. But for some folks, they don't want to be on television all over the world or even all over the city. And we have to tell them, we need you to come forward. And we were able to persuade them to do it. But it was a lot of hands-on, and there was a lot of work. And I can hardly believe that the first leg of this journey is almost over, but we still got a long ways to go.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you for that very detailed answer. We have now a question from Naz Shah. Naz is, of course, Member of Parliament for Bradford West. I believe you both have met. But over...
Assalamu alaikum, Naz. She there?
Yeah, she is here, but she just needs to, there we are. Here she is.
Good to see you again, albeit on Zoom. And it's really inspiring to hear what you've said. And thank you, Muddassar, for inviting me on as a panelist. I suppose for us, British policing is very different. I've served on the Home Affairs Select Committee here, and we've had, I think it's 164 deaths in police custody. And of them, 13, I think, were Black people. And that makes it twice as likely for a Black person to die still in custody in the UK. So what are the lessons, if any, that we could learn as the United Kingdom to make sure, because we've seen some high-profile campaigns, which are, and I've worked with lots of them in the past, with trying to get justice, and they don't, and it takes absolutely years. And you've managed to do this. I get it that there's been, there's a whole world movement on this issue, but on the George Floyd's death. But what about those that don't get that kind of? How do we push forward and work together with those that don't necessarily get that kind of publicity, don't get that outrage, don't get to go viral on Twitter, and had it not been for, like you said, the 17-year-olds who taped it, would it have just been another statistic like the rest of them?
Well, to answer your last question first, yes, I think there's a very good chance that without the video, we wouldn't be having this conversation. It'd be another sad statistic. And people on the scene would have said they killed that man. Other folks like Derek Chauvin said, I didn't do anything. What are you talking about? And it would have just like smoke, drifted up into the air. Possibility of a civil suit, to get money damages, but a criminal prosecution unlikely. Well, what I would say is that it kind of goes back to what I tried to say in the beginning. We know the differences between the UK and the US. We kind of sounded different. The culture's a little different. The legal setup's a little different. There's a few things that are different, but so many stunning similarities, right? And what I would say is that the story of police brutality in the United States has been one of non-accountability. Naz, you may be kind of young for this, but there was a guy named Rodney King who was brutally beaten in the early 1990s. And you could look it up, if you're not familiar with Rodney King, was beat 57 times on video, and the officers were prosecuted for it, but they were acquitted. They were found not guilty, which is stunning and outrageous to everyone. The bottom line is, even when you get the cases to trial, you don't necessarily win because you still got a jury who's been trained to resolve all doubts in favor of the police. So what do people like you and I do, Naz, public officials whose job it is to solve these problems? Well, you got to work on them when there's no crisis, and you got to work on them when there is. A year before George Floyd died, I convened a task force on reducing deadly force encounters with the police. I'll put that in the chat for you so you can take a look at it. And we engaged, we engaged the police, people in the law enforcement community. We also engaged people in the civil rights, human rights community. We made sure that there was a diverse group of people of all colors and backgrounds. And we agreed from the very beginning that the conversations were going to make some people uncomfortable, but we were going to plow through them anyway. And we came up with a number of things that I believe advanced the ball forward. Not enough, because George Floyd was still killed, but we didn't just work on it in the heat of a crisis. We worked on it when when there was no national case that was inflaming the passions of everyone. And quite honestly, some of the activists were like, well, yeah, this is just another government thing. It's not going to work. And we said, well, maybe it won't, but what are we supposed to do? Not do anything? So we kept working hard. So I would consider, if I were you, Naz, convening a group to work on reducing deadly force encounters with the police right there in the UK. And, invite the cops on. I don't know, what do y'all call the police in the UK? Bobbies or something? The police. Okay, good. So we call them cops. There's all kind of slang names for the police in the US. But you know, invite some of them on who are of good faith, because there will be some. Invite, you know, people from the civil rights community, you know, the activist community, but the ones who just don't believe in anything, maybe you don't invite them because, you know, they won't, you know, but the civil rights community that believes that reform is possible, that it has a little bit of hope left, that things can be better, because not everybody does, you know, invite them, and then hold your meetings. Now, if you are in London and you want to go to, say, one of the farther parts of the UK, how long of a drive is that?
Well, to my constituency from London, it's a good 4 hours door to door, and then going up to Scotland is another 4 or 5.
Oh yeah, well, so you might need so if you do a national program, you might need to get in the plane sometimes. But what I'm saying is, you don't want to just do it all in London. You want to do some in your district, some in the southern districts. You might want to do a few in Scotland. You want to do a few, right? And you want to get you want to try to do it in a way that involves the conservatives and labor if you can. But even if it's but it'll be somewhat dissatisfying to everybody, because the people on the progressive left it's not enough. But the people in the police community be like, oh, it's an anti-cop thing. But the bottom line is, you keep this group together and come out with some really good stuff, and you will make some progress. You will save some lives. You may not save everyone. It may not end the practice, but it is critical to do it, particularly with the numbers you shared. Those are pretty startling, you know, and, you know, we all know that, I mean, the world knows that the UK is having a little trouble sharing the country with the brown people. You know, they're having a little trouble with that. They're thinking like, we kind of think UK should be all white. Well, it's not going to be, you know what I mean? And so bottom line is, it's important for you to just continue to demonstrate to every member of the community in the UK that the UK is for all colors, all races, all religions. And so it's in all belong, and nobody's excluded. And you're not more British because you're white, you know, and you're not less British because you're black or brown, you know. So, and you know, the other thing I would do is I'd make sure you have a diverse group. You know, you want to make sure people from the Asian community are involved too. You want to make sure that people from the Afro-descendant community, I don't know what other large minority populations are in the UK, but you don't want to have a situation where you don't have something of a representative sample. And then when you do community hearings and community meetings, you know, you want to do them in places where that don't get a lot of attention, right? And I'm going to make a prediction, Naz. If you're able to do this, you're going to have some community meetings where literally hundreds of people are going to show up and want to testify about what happened to them and their loved ones. Because if you've lost about 160, I thought I heard you say?
64, but out of them, 13 were black over 10 years. But
yeah,
if you statistically speaking, when the black community makes up 3% of the population, you're twice as likely to die in police.
Right. But with those numbers, you're going to, those are just the folks who died. What about the people who were just treated like crap and beat up and smacked around and called nasty names by the police? There's a whole lot more than that number is like times 5. You know what I mean? So, you know, and by the way, that's that's what I'd recommend. And if you want to work on that, just know that you got my full support, and I'll be more than happy to. I've been talking to Muddassar about making a trip back over there, so we could talk about it.
Such a brilliant idea. I'd love to see you both actually do a full-on discussion just on this topic, but thanks for that, Keith. I'm going to move on now.
Good to see you, Naz.
Good to see you again.
Moving on to my next question. Since assuming the role of Attorney General, your office has sought several similar cases to George Floyd's, including the death of Daunte Wright, which occurred in April of this year. How will you approach these new cases, and will your office attempt to bring justice to other victims of police brutality in other states?
Well, because I'm the Minnesota Attorney General, I'm kind of confined to the Minnesota. But I do work with other attorneys general all the time about these matters, and we're in touch and we talk about them. I've been in conversations with people in Michigan, Washington, D.C., California, people in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Illinois about these issues. So I'll work on it in terms of just advising colleagues as to how they might approach it. In terms of my own office, as I noted before, the governor has the legal authority to appoint the attorney general in any case that he or she wants, and that local county attorneys, and there's 87 counties in Minnesota, can ask me to get involved. So normally when there's an in custody death, they don't call us. But because community is so dissatisfied and feels that the prosecutor's office can't credibly investigate and prosecute police officers because of the tight connection that they have and the fact that they have a daily working relationship, more of these cases, we're being turned to more and more. So my argument to the governor of my state is we need more money. If you want us to do these cases, we will do them, but we need more resources. And because these cases are resource intensive, they're not easy. And I know a lot of people who are on our broadcast today are thinking, oh, what do you mean? The videos are so simple. They're so obvious what happened. I'm like, yeah, but, I'm sure that in the UK, if you have a jury and somebody says, I know all about this case and I believe that the officer's guilty, that person won't make it onto the jury. Am I right about that? Of course I am. So the bottom line is you've got to find that. So the jury is made up of people who don't really have well-formed conclusions about what already happened. So once you get that body of people making the decision, anything can happen. And the truth is most people have more of a police bias than they do otherwise. Even Black people, they often think to themselves, well, was that guy doing something he wasn't supposed to be doing? Was that person, were they on drugs? All this kind of stuff comes up that really often has nothing to do with the guilt or innocence of the officer. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Keith. Now we're going to take a question from Alex Johnson. Alex is the Director of Global Partnerships at the Open Society Foundation, based in Washington, D.C., I believe. Over to you, Alex.
Hey there, Alex.
It's great to see you again, sir. And I have to say first, you are deeply missed on Capitol Hill, but it's phenomenal to see you in service to your community back in Minnesota. As you know, I worked closely with the late Representative Alcee Hastings on a number of transatlantic exchanges that have resulted in conversations like this. And so we appreciate his courage and leadership and really deeply appreciated your support for those initiatives at that time. And I think your return to Minnesota really demonstrates that political participation matters. You are in an elected position. As you indicated, the governor has a role to appoint the attorney general to specific cases. Who the governor is matters. And that is one of the reasons why Mr. Hastings spent a lot of his career promoting transatlantic exchanges on political inclusion throughout Europe, throughout many other countries. And as we've seen by your case that you had worked on, it has touched and really inspired movements to seek accountability for cases in France around, for example, Adama Traoré, who experienced very similar circumstances in 2016 at the hands of police. And that is why your statement that you said in the video clip that Muddassar showed really matters. Justice isn't served yet. It is a step towards accountability. So in this transatlantic context and dialogue that we have here, how do you recommend to the authorities in the UK, as you have just did, to other countries in Europe, but also beyond in South America, elsewhere, where similar cases are underway, how do they move towards accountability in similar cases?
Well, one thing I want to say, Alex, is that it's great to see you, and I miss being on Capitol Hill. I like being back in Minnesota, but I miss being on Capitol Hill. So it's great to see you. And all, Alcee Hastings was a hero and a mentor of mine, and I You know, I'll never forget him. May he rest in peace. Well, let me just say this. The first thing I'd say, Alex, is that in the United States, we need to get into a collaborative exchange of information about how we have just, fair policing everywhere in the world. We have a lot to learn from the UK. We really do. With our racial history, we're not in a position to go around and tell anybody what to do. I mean, it's awful. I mean, but actually there's no patch of this earth that we live on where everybody's only ever loved everybody else and been kind. So there's plenty of work for everybody to do, but we've got to do it, I think, in a multilateral way. I can tell you right now, my wife's from Colombia and she grew up in Medellin. And right now, if you guys are watching the news in Colombia, the police are brutal and abusing people really bad. And so that's a serious problem. We know that parts of the Middle East, you know, when one of the things that really sparked the Arab Spring, and Muddassar knows this well, is police brutality in Cairo and in Alexandria. You know, it's so what Shadow Minister Nandy said in the beginning and what MP Shah said are very, very correct. You know, this issue is global, and and what it really is, what it all boils down to is people who are in power, whether they're trying to maintain a racial hierarchy, an economic hierarchy, an ethnic hierarchy, a hierarchy of the royals over everyone else, or whatever it is, use the police to do their dirty work. And we've got to get into a conversation where these kind of tactics simply are not tolerated in society. And it makes sense to have a global conversation about it. Personally, I think that this conversation between us and the US and in the UK is a very good place to start, because essentially the United States inherited its legal system from the UK. And so we can speak in common terms. You know, not everybody in the world knows what you're talking about when you say a jury, right? But, you know, we can have these kind of dialogues. And so it's a good place to start, you know, and given America's background of racism and segregation and UK's history and colonialism, you know, there are some very clear parallels. So I just want to encourage us to continue to do this. And I'll just say this, Alex, you know as well as anyone being in Washington that there's a fairly significant number of people who are anti-globalism. They don't want to know what the rest of the world is talking about. They're not interested in how other places do things. And it's up to you and I to remember to remind people that, you know, this is one small world we live in, and we got to figure out how to make it better for everybody everywhere.
Thank you, Keith.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for joining us. We're now going to take a question from Sam Tarry. Sam Tarry is a member of Parliament for Ilford South in the UK. So over to you, Sam, now. I think he's here with us now.
Hey, Muddassar, can you hear me okay? Great. Well, look, it's a real honour to be here with Attorney General Keith Ellison. I represent one of the most diverse parliamentary constituencies in the country. I think our next census will probably show that we're 70% minority, so majority minority.
Wow.
You may not think that looking at me, but it is the community I grew up in and came from. And I took the liberty of asking some of our leading Black activists actually what they wanted me to talk about before we came on the programme today. And look, first of all, I'd just like to say, you know, a lot of people here in the UK actually followed that trial really carefully. You know, people in my local Black community and our local Black churches followed it, and there was a sense, you know, that justice was done. And, you know, what it sparked off had huge repercussions in this country, people taking to the streets, you know, in my local community, in cities all over the UK, in places like Bristol. You know, you probably heard about the statue of the slave trader that was thrown into the river there. And it did feel like a moment. But I think, you know, one of the questions to my community would really like your advice on is how, for example, when the Black community is really under pressure, how do we kind of become better at being self-organized, about organizing to build Black leadership in our community? And it's something I'm trying to do as a political representative, to give the support, the finance, the space, get the trade unions involved to support that work. Because I've seen the power of that. I was very lucky to visit the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama, and see and learn about the history of, you know, the movement there, the civil rights movement. And in the UK, we've got some tremendous and inspirational leaders and figures in the Black community, but we don't always have those traditions of being organized in quite the same way, using some of the networks. And I think one of the things that we really find is that the Black community in my part of East London has been struggling to find its political voice. And so we want to have a program of actually developing people who will be future leaders, who will step up to become local councillors and, you know, step up to go into higher political office, members of parliament and so forth. And I just really wondered if you could maybe just make a comment on, you know, your experience of being a Black person that's reached such a high level and actually changed history, and how you've kind of, you know, fallen back on supporting your own community and got organized to fight back and in the end to win, hopefully.
Yeah, thank you, Samuel. Great question, great comments. And thanks for sharing a little bit about your district. I mean, I think that I'm on this call to learn as much as I am to share. And so I really appreciate it. And Muddassar, when I come to the UK, we're gonna go check out Sam's district.
I was just gonna say, we're gonna go taste some of the food in his district.
That's right. Now, I already got a good taste of the kebabs at the kebab house, but we'll go on over to your district, Sam. So anyway, I just want to say this. In the United States, because of segregation, it forced Black organization, right? So there had to be an NAACP, there had to be a Black Panther Party, there had to be, we were driven together. And in fact, in the United States, you had something called the one drop rule. So you had a lot of people who, if you looked at them, you wouldn't necessarily know that they were Black, but they had Black heritage. But we were all together because that was the way the society was structured. In places like the UK or Brazil or other places where there really has not been Jim Crow laws as we know them, or like in the US or South Africa, sometimes, people that, they come from different places and spaces and they find themselves sort of in the same boat. What I would recommend, Sam, and you've probably already done this, but if you haven't, you might try it, is for you to just say, we're going to have this Samuel Terry Leadership Forum. And then on a regular basis, have people come and just talk about issues of common concern. And then have other folks come in to just talk to them about public speaking, about civic engagement, and just sort of like create like a little training ground for folks. We used to have a senator named Paul Wellstone. Maybe some of y'all have heard of him. He was a senator, died in a plane crash tragically. And after he died, we pulled together something called Wellstone Action. And what it was is we would bring people in for a fixed amount of time, teach them how to run for office if they were interested, teach them how to work on campaigns if that's what they wanted to do, and give them skills from small dollar fundraising, public speaking, running meetings, and then they would kind of graduate from that program after a few weeks, and then they would go on and be involved in a whole range of things. And it created a pipeline of people who had developed some skills, developed some relationships. Because another thing that happens with this stuff, Sam, is that people get to know each other. You'd be surprised that, kind of in a relatively small town or neighborhood, how people don't necessarily know each other. And you bring them together. And the effect is, if you keep it up for 3 or 4 years, 5 years, you got a whole train of folks who have gone on. Some of them will be campaign managers, some of them will be candidates for office, some of them will be in office, but there will be this, and then you'll see voices develop, you'll see people develop policies that they believe are critical. They'll come on down to Parliament and sort of talk to you guys about the importance of passing a piece of legislation or whatever. And that is kind of how that happens. And so it could happen. So That's my thoughts about it. You might have done some form of that already, but I just think that drawing people together, getting them up in front of folks, because as you know, the number one fear people have is public speaking. Some of us who are politicians, like on this call, we're like, oh, I don't have no problem with that. But for most people, it's terrifying to get up in front of a group of people and talk about something. And so but the more they do it, the better they get at it, the more comfortable they get at it. So those are just a few ideas I had. Are y'all working on anything like that? Or is that something you might be able to do?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, look, I had a long history as a community organizer in East London for a long time. And I think that it's about bringing people together and creating those forums, because actually there are a lot of Black community organizations in Ilford, but they're not working together in a joined up kind of way, organizing together. So their collective power is actually far greater than they realize. And I think the first step is to do that, create that forum, and then provide. And actually, look, we have a good relationship in Labour Party with trade unions, for example, talking to them about how we can actually fund some leadership programs. As you say, it doesn't take a lot of money to give people that basic training. Actually, it's more about time. Can we get people to donate their time to train other people who can then step forward and to do this? And I think if we do that, I think we'll really start to kind of bring people forward, because the energy is there, the anger is there, and we've got to channel it into actually taking that kind of that direct action and stepping up and having the confidence to do that. And look, I mean, look, I'm someone that grew up in the church community, and if you can get up and give a decent sermon, then you can definitely get up and give a political speech, in my view. And by the way, one thing I would say, if you come to East London, we call the police the Old Bill. I don't know why, but that's what they're called in East London.
There you go. We all got a name. Well, yeah, well, thanks for sharing that, Sam, and I look forward to seeing you soon when I get over there.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you so much. What a great idea. I'd love to see that happen. Now, moving on to another question from me. After coming to office, President Joe Biden stressed that his administration will focus on healing America. What do you think the new administration can and needs to do to address systematic racism in the justice system? And how will things like the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act or the end of qualified immunity improve policing?
Well, those are good questions. Let me start out by saying the president, I'll just admit to you guys, I was a Bernie Sanders guy early on. And so I have to admit, I've been very positively impressed by the president. There are some areas I wish he would be more vocal in. I'll leave our disagreements to the side for a moment. But the fact that he went and spoke about the Tulsa race riot that occurred in 1921, I don't know, a lot of the folks on the call from the US probably know about it, but for those of you who may have never heard of it, in 1921, there was a thriving Black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And Oklahoma was in an oil boom, so it was a very prosperous community. Anyway, one particular day, this young Black man bumped into accidentally a white woman. Somebody ran out and said that he assaulted her. Then they said he raped her. None of this was true. It was all a lie. They arrested the guy. Some Black men went out there to stand in front of the jail to say, you're not going to lynch this guy. A white mob assembled and said, oh, we are going to lynch this guy. Next thing you know, shots were fired. A lot of people died. 300 African-American people were killed. And they used airplanes to bomb the segregated Black community that had grown so prosperous. They used airplanes and bombed them from the air. One of the first times that ever happened certainly in the United States soil. And it's called the Tulsa Massacre. Now, this is something that if you grew up in Tulsa, you may never even have heard of. They don't want to talk about it. It's embarrassing. It's a shameful part of Oklahoma history. So I know people who grew up in Tulsa and didn't know about it. Well, on the 100th anniversary, President Biden spoke movingly about this. He didn't whitewash it. He didn't say it didn't happen. He said it happened. It happened. It was wrong. And our society has to reform from these kind of things. And we're not going to get better by just acting like it didn't occur. So that kind of symbolic acknowledgement is important and goes a long way towards healing, but it doesn't go far enough. There's got to be a lot more of that. There were literally hundreds of these kind of tragic events. In Duluth, my own state, 3 Black circus workers were lynched and hanged on lamp posts in the city. And there are many, many others. And, there's There's one in Wilmington, North Carolina. There's one in Rosewood, Florida. There's a lot of them. My point is acknowledging this horrific, brutal history is critical. And the other thing is then to pass meaningful change like the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And I'm not familiar with the Breathe Act that Lisa talked about, but that piece of legislation sounds intriguing. We need to dig into that, and there needs to be an acknowledgement that when it comes to communities, Black communities, and even some poor white communities, the history has been, we're gonna invest in policing and prison, and we're not gonna invest in education and better infrastructure and things like that. So there's gotta be a massive investment in just livability, better wages, fairness. These are the things that I think we've got to do.
Thanks for that, Keith. We're now going to take what you Americans call councilwoman and we call councillor, Mariam Dawood, a local politician here in London. Over to Councillor Mariam.
Hi, Keith. It's so lovely to see you again.
Hey, Mariam.
Hi, and thanks,
doing?
Muddassar, for having me. I'm good. How are you?
Very good. Very good. Great to see you.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks, Muddassar, for having me. And it was great to hear from Sam Tarry earlier. I have to say, though, the London Borough of Newham, which I represent, takes the crown for the most diverse borough in the UK. And we also have one of the largest growing numbers of young people here. So, Keith, you've been in politics for almost 2 decades. First in Minnesota's House of Representatives, then the first Muslim congressman, and now the first Muslim Attorney General. Can you tell us a bit about your journey in public office and any challenges that you faced? Do you have any advice for young Muslim politicians like me?
Yeah, yes, I do. Salaam alaikum. Let me tell you this. When I ran for office the first time, it was sort of by accident. I had gone to the state legislature and was trying to convince them not to do something that I thought was going to make things worse. And I came home, I dropped my bag on the floor and it kind of made a bump and it was kind of loud. And my wife said, "What's your problem?" And I said, "These people, they don't listen, blah, 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 blah." So I said these things. And so she said, "Well, why don't you run for office?" And I said, "I will." So next thing you know, our living room is a campaign office, right? And, you got all kinds of campaign stuff in there. And then, I run and I end up in the state legislature. So it really was not a plan. I never said, I want to be the first Muslim, this or that. I never factored that in. But pretty soon people started coming after me for being Muslim. And I always stepped up and said, "Yes, I'm Muslim, very proud to be Muslim. And what are you? Let's talk religion, And so took it on. Don't ever back off from it. But I just want to tell any young Muslim politician, do not make the central focus of your campaign your religion. Because ultimately, it's not about you, right? It's not about you, it's about them. It's about the people we represent, not us, So the focus should be on your service, right? And you should live a life such that, you're exhibiting Islamic values of service, of commitment, of honesty, of decency, of caring, of standing up even when it's hard to do so, of being truthful when it's hard to do so. And so that's how your faith should express within your work, and use it and build bridges. Not all the Christian people who are aware that Mariam is mentioned more in the Quran than she is in the Bible. Not all Christian people who are aware that the Quran refers to Jesus as Messiah. It's written right in there. And so bottom line is there's a lot of bridge building to be done, and you can do it. I wouldn't lead with it. I'd lead with, we're going to increase better. We're going to make life better for people here. And you're the expert on that, Mariam. But after identifying the critical issues, people will say, "Well, Mariam, aren't you one of them Muslims?" And you're going to say, yes, I am. What about it? You know, as a matter of fact, it's Ramadan. We're going to have an iftar and you are invited. Just so you know what it is we're up to in the mosque, right? You know, because people want to know, what are y'all doing in there? So, I mean, that's how I would say it. You are a pioneer, Mariam. You are, and there's no denying it. I mean, I know Muslim politicians get offended when people ask them about their religion. What for? In the United States, I was the first Muslim ever elected to Congress, which is weird because I don't think of myself as some old guy quite yet. I know I'm creeping up on that, but I mean, first one, wow, right? I'm happy to report that there are 3 now, and most of them are women, right? But that's sort of the story, you know, lead with your values, focus on the people who you're gonna serve, never run away from who you are, and I think you'll do fine. And by the way, people are better than we sometimes give them credit for. My district is about 25% brown folks. 75% of the people who elected me when I was in Congress are white, Lutherans mostly. And now that I'm a statewide official, I'd say maybe, I don't know, 10 or 12% of the state is not white, you know? And in your case, you know, you represent a very diverse district. But look, you know, here's Sam, a white guy, but the district is 70% brown folks. People are better than you. They're not just gonna say they're not gonna melanin test you for your service. They're gonna say, what are you gonna do for me? Now, I'm sure just like the white constituents I have are gonna say, what are you gonna do for me? And they're gonna hold me to that. But most people are not gonna come at me with like, I don't want a black person representing me. Most Minnesotans aren't like that. You know, they're just not. And I would imagine that most of the people you represent are not like that either. So for the people who are thinking about running and who think that because their name is Ahmed or Muhammad or Mariam that they can't run, you can run. But just don't make it about you. Make it about the people you're going to represent and care as much about their lives as you do that of your own family.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Mariam.
That was pretty inspiring and good advice. I'll take that on board.
Yeah, and
so
looking forward to seeing you in person.
Yeah, see you soon.
Yep.
Thank you, Mariam. Thank you, Keith. So moving on to another question from me. Unfortunately for public safety, the inability to hold police officers accountable leads to an atmosphere of distrust. Actually, distrust between law enforcement and communities stemming from the militarization of the police is linked to a rise in unsolved homicides and gun violence. You know all this. But how do we rebuild trust between the police and the people they're supposed to protect?
I think we've got to prosecute law breaking when people with badges do it. We certainly prosecute law breaking when people without badges do it. But if you have 2 systems of justice, and I'm not talking about race here, I'm just talking about badges and non-badges. If people have the sense that because you are endowed with the power to enforce law, that you don't have to obey it, that demeans people's respect for the law and their esteem for the law. And so you've got to prosecute that. And I'm telling you, police officers agree with what I just said. You know, one of the things that happened, and this is sort of a new thing, Muddassar, this is not common. Right after the tragic murder of George Floyd, 14 Minneapolis police officers, which is kind of a lot when you think about how rare this was, they posted a letter for the public, which said, Derek Chauvin failed as a human and stripped George Floyd of his dignity and life. This is not who we are. We are not the union or the administration. We stand ready to listen and embrace the calls for change, reform, build and rebuilding. Now, I know some folks will say, oh, that's just PR, but I think that imagine yourself joining the police department because you want to help people. You want to help people. You want to protect people's safety. You have a heart for the victim of a crime, and you want to be part of the solution. And then you got somebody next to you who's punching people in the face for no reason, who's calling people foul, nasty names, racial epithets. You're like, you are interfering with me doing what I'm here to do. And yet the policing in America has been such a fraternity that it's just not okay to even report an officer, and it's absolutely unheard of to intervene when an officer, a fellow officer, is breaking the law. We have hopefully broken that trend. We have broken that paradigm. And that is what I think will get the most attention, because you can try to retrain them. And some of these guys think of racial sensitivity training as a punchline of a joke. They just don't buy it. They think it's stupid. They don't pay attention, and they crack jokes throughout the whole thing. And you want to get somebody's attention, tell them you're looking at 20 years in prison for the murder you just committed. They're like, okay, I think we're speaking the same language now, so.
Thank you for that, Keith. We're now going to take a question from Saqib Qureshi, who's a fellow at the London School of Economics in the UK. Saqib.
Uh-oh, we got a genuine genius on the line here. That's what a privilege.
Yes, no, so I'm not quite sure what to say to that. How are you?
I'm all right, man. Good to see you, Saqib.
In light of all what's happened in the last 12 months with race relations in the US, how has your relationship with the slave owner after whom your capital city is named after, how has that changed? Not only in the last year, but the last decade or so. I mean, do you feel less attached to that founding father?
It's an excellent question, Saqib. So how do you, as a Black child growing up in America, ever grow to admire George Washington? I think it's kind of impossible if you know anything about George Washington. How do you ever go to admire Thomas Jefferson? These people have no connection to us other than they owned us, and that's how I've always seen them. My parents taught me to see them that way. And I got a feeling their parents taught them to see them. We don't think these people are anyone who's admirable. And so, but we do recognize people are complicated. So somehow Thomas Jefferson was able to own slaves and to write that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We recognize the complexity of people, that they're not one way, that they're not simple, and that people may be forward thinking on one thing and quite backward on another one. So that's the thing, I honestly, I don't think people are as upset with founding fathers who own slaves as they are with people who fought for the slaveocracy, right? So, there are people who took up arms for US independence. I mean, and it wasn't, honestly, there is a growing body of thought in the US academia that says not only was the Civil War fought to preserve slavery, so was the War of Independence. Because the UK had said, you know what, we're getting out of the international slave trade business. And the folks in South Carolina said, well, you might be, but we're not. No, really? And they in the UK said, no, we're not gonna do this anymore. And they're like, yeah, who you think's gonna get this cotton out of this field that I just planted? Who do you, and so there's a growing body of thought in a lot of literature to show that at least the Southern colonies, not necessarily Massachusetts and those guys up there, but certainly North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, they went to war to preserve their right to traffic in slavery, right? This is the founding fathers, man. And then there's all kinds of stories about how the founding fathers would basically rape their slaves and you know, and all these Black people running around, you know, who are descendants of Thomas Jefferson, you know, and so you held this woman in slavery, and yet you beget like numerous kids by her, you know. So there's a lot more hostility to the people who took up arms in the Civil War, and you know, there's simply no tolerance for the likes of Robert E. Lee, Forrest, what's that man? You know, Bedford Forrest, you know, who actually started the Ku Klux Klan and was a Confederate soldier. That's a great, now that's just for the Black community. A lot of people in the indigenous community, they're tearing down Columbus statues. You know, they're pulling down Columbus, you know, they're pulling down, you know, that kind of thing. So, I mean, it really kind of depends, you know, but if you're a American person who's not a, you know, not a descendant of the folks on the Mayflower, if you know what I'm talking about, we've always had an ambivalent attitude toward the founding fathers, and never looked at them as just sort of like, you know, just wonderful human beings who graced us with their wisdom, knowledge, and understanding.
Do you begin to feel that you're part of a multinational country?
Within the United States, or
yeah, do you think the US is really multiple nations, each with its own sense of past?
To a certain extent, I do feel like that, and it's kind of undeniable, but at the same time, we do have a certain shared legacy, right? I mean, slavery didn't just happen to Black people, it happened to white people too. And by the way, a fairly small percentage of whites ever owned slaves. Most of the white people who populated the United States in the beginning were people who were in debtors' prisons in England, who came over on 7 years of indenture. I mean, your average white person, they didn't own anyone. And that's one of the ironies of it all. You're getting ready to pick up arms to maintain a system that you don't benefit from. Now that's nuts, right? And in fact, one of the reasons that the United States needed to have laws specifically prescribing the behavior of Black people is because too many Black and white people were finding common cause. And then the plantation owners would be like, oh my goodness, they're ganging up against us. And you have the white, the Black, and the Native people coming marching on the plantation. So they said, wait a minute. If you're white, you're free. You don't, you know, you get certain little benefits. If you're Black, you're in slavery for life. And if you're indigenous, look out, because we're coming to kill you and we want to run you off this land and exterminate you. And so that is sort of the history, and that's how really segregation came up. They invented laws that say that if you're white, you cannot marry a Black person. You know, these are called miscegenation laws, legal, Saqib, right up until 1968.
Wow. Well, thank you.
You know?
Thank you for that, Keith. And what great question, Saqib. This has been such a fascinating exchange. And I know that we don't have you for much longer, Keith. So I want to ask you if you have any final words or closing remarks. We've covered so many different issues here today, and you've been so generous with your time and given us some really incredible, detailed. Man, why don't you have your own radio show?
Well, you and I should figure out how that might work, Muddassar. Maybe we should do it together. We can call it Across the Pond.
Hey man, I'll just be pulling you down. I mean, you need your own show. You know?
Well, you know, let me just say this. I just want to put in another plug for Concordia. Wonderful organization. Please support it. It is our best tool to come together, unify, learn from each other, and just really have fellowship and community across the Atlantic. Let me also say that it's very important to understand that the George Floyd case is really just a case if we don't take the lessons from it and build on it. And that means we've got to pass legislation. We've got to reconceive of the relationship between the individual and the state. We've got to bring people who are charged with the protection of us all into accountability. And the thing to know about that is most officers are okay with that. Some of them are not, most of them are. And so it's important to, as you organize, and Sam mentioned being an organizer, it's important to organize in all sectors and never just assume, oh, we can't find common cause with anybody over there. How do you know? There might be some folks in the police department who really say this situation sucks and we don't want to see it continue. So let's just stay in touch, keep working together, and remember that, you know, we've got to that this battle for respect and dignity for all is a long-term thing, and we're going to keep on pushing until we get there.
Well, I mean, on behalf of the Concordia Forum, I really would like to thank you, Keith, for joining us and openly discussing these complicated matters. And I'm going to say this here, and I've said it to you privately, but I really hope you can join us in Lisbon this year if things work out and you guys are allowed to fly. But no, it's been truly a pleasure. And I'd also like to thank the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy, all of the respondents who participated. Everybody made this such a beautifully rich discussion. So, and thank you everybody who joined us to watch this. Of course, the stream of today's event will be live on the Concordia Forum Facebook page. We'll also be releasing it as a podcast in a couple of weeks' time. And so sadly, this concludes our webinar. Thank you everyone for attending, and we truly hope you enjoyed today's discussion. Thanks again, Keith. Thank you.
Thank you. All right now.